Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about the newest album from Fiona Apple called Fetch the Bolt Cutters. In a way, it feels like I've already made this review, or that I've been writing it for years already. And I think to some extent that it's a little overdue, because Fiona Apple is the sort of artist whose legacy looms pretty large over a lot of acts that I really like and that I've praised. So much so that going back to her first few albums almost feels familiar on a different dimension. Also, I'm fairly certain the vast majority of women I have dated have been fans of Fiona Apple, so even when I wasn't altogether familiar with her work, I already kind of absorbed all her albums by osmosis over the past decade anyway. But what I find bizarre, though, is how it's often emphasized by some critics that Fiona Apple is difficult to discuss or analyze, which in the realm of singer-songwriters, I've always felt is kind of off base. Hell, in my opinion, one of Fiona Apple's greatest strengths is how accessible she can be to a certain point of view, especially on her first two albums that took a blur of smoldering alternative rock, jazz, singer-songwriter material, piano rock, and even trip-hop in the compositions, but she actually wrote hooks. And while the relationship drama she described was often emotionally complex, it wasn't impenetrable. But you know what, if you read some of the criticism of her from the mid to late 90s, it almost seemed like her approach to raw, sexually charged, incredibly intense relationship songs baffled predominantly male critics and music press. And they seemed more ready to call her provocative in an irony-drenched media landscape looking for the easy box to drop her in because nothing she was saying, particularly around sexual assault and rape, it could be that real, right? Oh yeah, well thankfully media discourse has evolved at least a little bit since the 90s and 2000s, but on the other hand, I'm also now living in a world full of Fiona Apple's artistic descendants, from Florence Welch to Adele to Nico Case to St. Vincent to Dessa to even Lorde, not to mention the dozens of women who took to the piano to mine Fiona Apple's accessibility without really treading into the darker waters in which she swam. But the other complicating factor is that, well, Fiona Apple's output got a lot more sporadic. Her vocal tone got huskier, her mixes more jittery and full of clattering percussion and baroque touches, and this did lead to some mixed results. I don't think she's put out a bad album, but Extraordinary Machine is not great, and as much as I really like The Idler Wheel, outside of certain moments, it's not a project I love, mostly because of some of the eccentric production choices didn't quite feel like more than the sum of their parts. But now we got Fetch the Bolt Cutters, and I'll admit, it's been very difficult to tamp down on my own expectations given how, frankly, insane the critical hype has been, especially from one particular outlet. I mean, I need to give this a little bit more time to sink in, fully absorb what she delivered so I can discuss it at length, and if I was to hop aboard the hype train, it'd be so under my own volition. But alright, what do we find on Fetch the Bolt Cutters? You know, I wanted to make this a standalone review because Fiona Apple is an artist to which I think demands a more complicated discussion in what I would normally provide in short form. But the weird thing about Fetch the Bolt Cutters is that for as tempestuous and frenetic as it can feel, once you become accustomed to its rhythms, daunting as that might be, it's not quite a project that surprises me or shocks me. Certainly not to the degree that so many people are falling over themselves to proclaim that it does. Not saying it's not a great album. It absolutely is. I'd argue it's her best since the 90s, and it features some genuinely impressive moments where the tension is nerve-wracking and you're listening to Fiona Apple hold the song together on force of will, but I'm not sure I'd put it among my best of the year thus far, and it'll be fascinating to see where this will land for me in 8 or so months. Part of this is the continuation of elements I didn't quite love on The Idler Wheel, but this album also has some unique hang-ups, and without necessarily condemning it, I do want to highlight some parallels to existing work from other artists that absolutely is there. And that's kind of important in a lot of the praise I've seen for Fetch the Bolt Cutters in being described as unprecedented in sound and approach and content, only maybe highlighting Yoko Ono's Experimentation as the most obvious peer. You don't even need to go back that far. The comparison that sprung to mind for me almost immediately was Nico Case's last album, Hell On, in which the grooves are absolutely more conventional, but the song structures and melodies can be just as extended and warped, and paradoxically just as deceptively catchy. More to the point, in the content and themes, there are some obvious parallels in the primal storm of emotions that are hemmed in and seeking the outlets to burst. Feminist in the wealth of expression and comfort in complexity and emotional abstraction. And to some degree, they're both albums that require a lot of time and patience to absorb, where accessibility can be a challenge in their own way. In both cases in terms of the melodies, for Nico Case in terms of a lot of her tangled songwriting, and for Fiona Apple in the sound as a whole. Where Case was able to cushion and amplify herself in the production, Fiona Apple's raw tones and multi-tracked harmonies will careen off every rattle and fractured melody, and are often split apart by the sound of her own barking dogs. And you know what? It's not perfect. Intentionally so, I would add. So discussing where the fractures work or don't work is kind of a complicated and very subjective conversation. For instance, there are a scattered few songs on this project that Fiona Apple has been performing live since around 2013, of which I've always felt is a little weird, because if you know that, it can take you out of a self-contained work. And even if Fiona Apple is making that a point, it does get a bit distracting. And while I really like Ladies in the context of the album, given the revisions I've seen of it since, I'm not nearly as fond of the older song I Want You to Love Me used as the opener. From a compositional standpoint, it doesn't quite feel as sharp, the extended outro does not help it as her voice starts to creak, and it feels kind of awkward to start a project like this when anticipation is so high. It's delaying the expectations, and not really in a great way. And while I'm on the subject of structure, it does feel a bit awkward. I get that the flow is supposed to be kind of ramshackle and stop and start, playing on wild unpredictability and waves of emotion, and that can be somewhat irrational, but it can also lead to lulls that don't have the same intensity as the scattered high points. And I'll say this right now, as much as I get the mantra of On I Go, a reclamation of time and deliberate pacing that is pretty much the explicit retort to everything I just said, the song also feels kind of lumpy and underwritten, and leaves the project feeling very open-ended, which, given her release schedule, is absolutely an anticlimax, which can do a disservice to some of the stronger moments here. Which also kind of drives me a little nuts, because the best moments here are pretty damn incredible, and let's start off with the production and instrumentation. Now, I'll admit, I'm not always the biggest fan of staccato, eclectic grooves that are overcompensating for the lack of stronger melody. It's one of the reasons I don't quite love the Idler Wheel in comparison with her 90s work. But what Fiona Apple does across the piano in terms of weird progressions off the jagged drum work, it's just goddamn remarkable. I love how the guitar curdles behind the arpeggiated moments on Shameika, and how the chord punctuation on that hook is ever so slightly off, which reinforces that crack in adolescent confidence. I love the sardonic rejoinders of bass playing off the drum work on the title track, which adds just enough restrained tension to start breaking through, which is a great lead into Under the Table with the solemn organs that are getting spiked by the jaunty pianos, or how the bass sounds so playful, building around the soulful intensity of Heavy Balloon, which becomes even more pronounced on the sultry patter of Cosmonauts. Probably the most conventionally structured and accessible song here with the fuller guitars, likely because Fiona Apple originally intended it for Judd Apatow's This Is 40 of all things. Thank God it wasn't included to that. But that's not counting the songs where the melody is stripped down to just her voice and the clattering drums, where she becomes the focal point in a mix where you're still keenly aware of the room around her because the pickups that feel more alive and the vocals are not obviously touched up. And yet, as someone who doesn't always get on board with it, I was shocked how much Fiona Apple's command of mantras and cadence was so striking to me. I used the word patter before, and it's so applicable in how not only can she lock into a rhythm, but then switch into something that's choppier and it sound just fractured enough to make her point, while not breaking apart the flow of the song. Relay being the most obvious example of it, but it's just as true with Newspaper, and especially too with the stellar 1-2 punch with For You and Drumset, the latter of which might be one of the most catchy things I've heard all year. Definitely an album highlight very late in. Now, all that being said, I've seen some criticisms of the mantra structure and placement on a lot of this project, that they become more of a focal point without a lot of lyrical development, or they can run long on songs that don't feel as fully composed. And I'm honestly a bit torn on this, because on the one hand, you can definitely say they absolutely have a place in the more meditative moments of tension that will unspool in strange or unorthodox ways, or feel more essential to the song's overall point. Relay, for instance, it's all about the cycle of abuse, and how much she will grapple with constructive outlets for her fury at unjust power structures that will elevate entitled assholes, we kind of all know who she's talking about there, where to stay sane by the end of the song, she has to be the one to break the cycle. Similar to the awkward undercurrent on Under the Table, where she's prodding at the disruptive nerve of the elegant party listening to more entitled assholes, or how Newspaper highlights the lingering tension between her and her ex's current partner, where she's got a lot of conflicted emotions, and maybe even a connection that she wants to nurture, but she has to stew in her own thoughts instead. But on the flip side, as I already brought up, the mantra and On I Go, it's the point, but just winds up feeling kind of unresolved. And hell, as much as I like a lot of the sentiments on the verses of the title track, where she has to break out of her own insecurities and self-destructive impulses to run free, and that Kate Bush reference is perfect there, well, the hook, it does start to feel a little stale by the end. And now that we're at the content, if I do have a criticism, it's that many of the arcs feel rather familiar for Fiona Apple, even if the thematic core is a little different. It's not an album that surprises or shocks me all that much in the revelations and focus, which is where you'd think the subject matter would come a little bit closer to matching the more experimental side of a lot of this production. It might just feel a little bit more natural to go there, even if it is reinforcing some of the accessibility. But again, that's not saying the content isn't potent. Again, in my opinion, it's really the biggest draw of this project, especially in striking the balance between being self-critical and examining the rifts that people will drive between each other, driven off of arrogance and pride and insecurity and depression. And like always, there's a very measured hand in the framing. And there's something almost childlike in how Fiona Apple will just careen through these stories with exuberance and abandon, but more than enough maturity and forethought at her age to wryly muse on them now. I like how Shameika shows the titular character remark how Apple had potential, that all the projection of strength in her youth could become more potent and inwardly focused, and then following up with a title track, showing just how far she would need to buck against every projection upon her to find that freedom, and how just spurning her own backlash was still done because of them. To quote Jeff Winger from the pilot of Community, either way, they win. But what's so fascinating is that she doesn't just place herself in a disconnected void. She does crave that empathetic connection with other people. And that takes us to songs like Ladies and Newspaper, where she sees how men and society at large is built to perpetuate conflict between women instead of fostering friendship and strength. But here's the thing, it's not an automatic men are trash narrative here either. I mean, Rack of His is pretty scathing in highlighting how disposable some guys can treat their relationships in comparison with their passions elsewhere, and she spares no words for her furious call out on For Her, the darkest moment on the album, in both highlighting his callous behavior and the women who are struggling to live within that system and then wind up getting abused. But then it's followed by Drumset, where she knows guys will lie to salvage their own egos, and she has to contextualize some of her own abandonment issues, and she knows some of it is just not rational. Look at Cosmonauts, which is a musing on monogamy, which opens up with the frustrated line, whatever you do, it's gonna be wrong. And yet it's on a song that's all about the challenge to make something work. Hell, even on For Her, you've got lines like, you should know, but you don't know what you did, highlighting how a lot of men in that system are not really confronted with consequences of their actions because they're rarely held to account. Hell, the bolt cutters are intended for anything, it's for institutional patriarchy that will break apart sisterhood and perpetuates a battle of the sexes that hurts everyone, especially when love gets messy and compromises everything, where the freedom comes in being able to move independently, both internally and externally. But as a whole for the album, I would argue this is a trickier project to assess beyond just pure unadulterated praise, even though I've had a lot of that. It's richly nuanced, but it's raw. It's fractured, but thematically solid. It hits as hard as she ever has, but kind of inconsistent in the impact. It disposed a lot of the subtlety that I really did love on her first two albums, but it might be better for it? Again, it's a project that is potent in the explicit imperfections, and that will not hit everybody in the same way, and that's the risk you run with a less composed approach. And again, it's not like Fiona Apple is the first, nor the only, nor the best artist to touch this territory, and I did find myself wishing that the snapshots of unique brilliance were a bit more consistent. But as such, for me, very strong 8 out of 10, high recommendation for an excellent album. It's absolutely a project that will grow on you, and it's worth a lot of listens. And as for the hype, well, you know what? I'm gonna quote the song that I liked the least on the album. I only move to move. Not saying she doesn't move, but she's deliberate about where she does. Worth thinking about. That's all I'm saying. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know this review ran long. It's inevitably going to be controversial because this is getting so much praise, but hey, if you want to talk more about it, comments are down there. Have fun. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And I understand right now, you're in the middle of current times, it might be hard to support the channel in any regard. If you gotta do your own stuff, I understand. But if you'd like to, link to my Patreon right over there, where you guys get to vote or even add albums to my schedule. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.
Why did you not want to try? Why did you take it all away?